My background in relation to ICTs and information communication technology and education, in a sense, was really kick-started by my involvement in this ALTC funded project. This was conducted in about 2008 and 9 with various people from the Faculty of Arts and Education, and we were looking at teaching and learning delivery modes in arts and education subjects. And our basic intention was just to get a sense of what students felt about this. And we surveyed them as in terms of their preferences for online versus hard copy delivery, for example. And this was fairly radical results that came back, which again, I don't think surprises many of us who are at the coalface teaching and learning. And with the push to introduce more and more materials and resources and teaching online, I'm actually wondering whether one of the key stakeholders that have been left out is being our students themselves. And I don't know if enough has been done to actually get into the student population and ask how they feel about these changes that are happening here at Monash, for example, and other places. Please.
Have you read on the survey?
Not yet, no.
I suggest that there's been a lot of change from 2007 to today, particularly with social media and the ubiquitous nature of handheld devices.
Sure. No, I agree. I think it's
you should see how many students then were carrying a laptop in the
yeah. It is a bit, I mean, this also came on the back of the Kennedy study that was done at Melbourne University that found the same things. And I guess the point I want to raise here is that, again, this sort of cautious approach to the use of ICT in education in terms of a whole range of stakeholders. I think Bennett very much described it as a moral panic, as an academic moral panic. And so again, that's just something I'm putting out as part of the conversation. I hope I don't come across as a Luddite or someone who actually is against using this, but I get nervous as someone trained in the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory when I sense that there's an accompanying discourse which to some degree or another exaggerates some of the key fundamentals. And I think we always need, as educators, just to look at the surrounding discourse of any element in teaching and learning, and sometimes make sure that we're taking the best of it rather than just the superficial hype that can be attached to these sorts of programs. Anyway, that's just again scene setting. And please, at any time we want to have a discussion, we're very happy to talk as we go. Anyway, this abstract is on the paper, so I'll leave that. All right, so let's get on with, I apologize about this. This should be massive open online courses. There are a number of main providers. Obviously, edX and Coursera tend to be taking the lead. These programs, I think, have a bit of a history. The MIT project in the late 90s, early 2000s, where a lot of MIT content was placed online, open to subscribers free of charge. This was one of the early sort of innovations in the area. Another was the Phoenix project, again experimenting towards the end of the 1990s with a wholly online university. These sorts of early projects were considered, I think, by many to not have been entirely successful. And so I think there was a lull through the later 2000s in viewing, let's just say, the web as a prime mover in the development of teaching and learning. To such a degree that I was feeling relatively relaxed about things until the beginning of last year, when it became apparent that there was a whole tidal wave, really, that had built up again and had been unleashed. I think history will talk about the artificial intelligence MOOC that was presented by a couple of people, was it Stanford or someone that attracted hundreds of thousands of enrollments. This is sort of the genealogy, I guess, of the contemporary phenomenon. A friend at Melbourne University who works in Second Life and issues to do with that particular platform is a bit more cynical than me. His position is, look, we've seen these revolutions before. They come, they peak, there's a bit of a hype cycle about them, they fall away, and then it's back to business as usual. I guess one of the points I would be arguing in this presentation is that I don't think we're going to go back to that sort of position again. I think the impact of MOOCs is going to be quite profound in a whole range of different areas. I think looking at the presentation or composition or outrolling of undergraduate courses in the next few years will be, in some areas, very, very different from the way that it's done today. I think we might even see some smaller universities or institutions, if not already, about to implement this, thinking very seriously in some minority areas, almost rolling in content from outside and teaching content that they're either specialist in or have good numbers in face-to-face or in a more blended environment, but in a way outsourcing some of their content in some of the other areas from these sorts of MOOCs. Here's a typical MOOC campus. I like the fact that they emphasize the sort of interpersonal aspects here when it seems to be almost quite ironic that given that MOOCs are totally delivered, or I say, via the net, that this sort of face-to-face, which tends to be a representation of what we might expect at the campus like Monash or any of the other campuses where face-to-face is more of a priority. Having said that, it was very interesting in the presentation Adam Shoemaker gave recently, where he said one of the interesting phenomena that is appearing is that some of the MOOCers actually set up face-to-face groups with each other. That's fascinating. So they're online, they're doing their programs, and yet there's a sort of a impetus to arrange study groups, and so they get together and meet face-to-face, and that apparently seems to be a very strong movement within the MOOC community. Equally strong, of course, and this is a phenomenon which many people raise as soon as we start talking about MOOCs, is the dropout rate. Yes, it seems to be something which bothers people. I don't see it yet, no.
It's an issue.
It's an issue. Yeah.
That's right.
No, I agree with you. I don't think it is. And it's one of those almost red herrings. Is partly how I see it. But I'm not going to run through all of these. These are actually in the handout that I've presented. But all I've listed these for is for people who maybe have heard about MOOCs, not quite sure what's going on. Very quickly, I just wanted to present some of the contemporary discourse about MOOCs that is out there in a range of different sources. If you would like to read these, I think I've included these in the handout for your benefit. So here again is this idea that, oh yeah, it's all the excitement, it's another sort of also run web phenomenon. A, I don't think it's such a problem, and B, I think we'll find that that figure might actually stabilise at much less than that in some ways. You see. All right, a tale of two MOOCs. Simply to talk about MOOCs, we've actually not having a look at some. I've enrolled in. Is anyone who else is enrolled in MOOCs? Yes. No. Haven't dropped out yet.
Not yet.
No.
Haven't done anything there.
No. All right. So this is Coursera. I'm not sure which brand you're going with.
Yeah, Coursera world history.
Okay. And is it very much like this, a standard sort of format with the video? Yes, it seems to be the template that's, I won't even say involved, because I don't think it's very complicated anyway, very complex. So this is what happens. We have a provider, the University of Edinburgh, linked into Coursera. It's like a franchise almost. And we see, I don't think anybody will, you want to go for Geelong, just. Now, will this evolve? Will it become more sophisticated? It may be more sophisticated already in different MOOCs and different presenters.
I'm Dave Ward. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm helping to organise this course, Introduction to Philosophy. So the idea behind the course is to give you an introduction into some of the different areas that philosophers study. So every week on the course, me and some of my colleagues at the University of Edinburgh are going to give you
All right, it's again quite a standard template it appears. I'll quickly show you another one which I have enrolled in. So this is writing for the web, much smaller, only 4 modules. Now this is run by Open Universities Australia. It's interesting because Open Universities actually were in negotiation with Monash to actually take on Monash content. Is anyone really high up and important? I mean, you're all important. Be careful with what I say, but I think even Adam's been quite forthright with where Monash stands in terms of engaging with being part of a franchise. And at the moment, it seems to be that Monash is keeping its powder dry, as it were. It hasn't jumped in as several of the other other major universities in the G8 have. ANU, for example, jumped in with one or the other. And so it appears to be the case that Monash has been reasonably cautious and seeing exactly where it's best to position themselves in the MOOC landscape, and also to think about the content. When this came out, one of the subjects I teach, we put our hand up and said, look, we'd love to be involved in this, in advanced professional writing. But again, we're told at the moment Monash content isn't available for distribution, even through Open Universities Australia, and we all know that Monash is a partner with Open Universities Australia. So this person's got the nod. You can see this emphasis on quizzes, I think, which is quite an interesting aspect of MOOCs. It lends itself to that sort of multiple choice assessment. And, well, then what we'll make a quick touch on later, this sort of, there's not a lot of theory out there yet about this phenomenon, the gamification element in MOOCs and other aspects, whereby techniques drawn from gaming, yes, computer gaming are being introduced, so there are steps and hurdles, and people don't progress through particular MOOCs, not all MOOCs, without actually meeting certain requirements. And this is one of the few sort of, I guess, scholarly tropes that's going around in the discourse of MOOCs as to the benefit or the implications of introducing this sort of gamification into assessment at higher education. Again, my crystal ball gazing would suggest that in certain subjects in the next 5 to 10 years, I would imagine this will become fairly commonplace in some of those big first-year subjects in particular, like biology 1, philosophy 1, where there can be a fairly standardized curriculum. And again, it's all about watching the space, I guess, and seeing once 1 or 2 universities make the break. I'm not going to sort of suggest what I think will, but the one I think that will be first is a big university on the northern outskirts of Melbourne with the initials LTU, especially in certain areas. Then I think that what can I say, it will become inevitable for other universities to follow. So very quickly, hopefully this isn't too boring for people. Go to the classroom. So already 658 students. This was only opened up, I think, less than 2 weeks ago. And I'll keep you informed as to how we go with it. But that's basically what it looks like. Nobody's explored it or seen it. No big deal in a way. It's fairly standard. Okay, back to the presentation.
I think I would have hired a lot for the equipment field, just footnote.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay.
Simplicity.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the time frame they had to get that together was amazing. You know, maybe 6 weeks or 8 weeks between when we were contacted and then to come out with that. Which is fantastic.
I just mean look and feel.
Oh, yeah.
The content
As well.
provided don't change anything.
No, sure.
It's quite the content.
Which suggests that they're throwing a lot of money at it. Yeah. Right. All right. So just to sum up some of the things that, if anything, to give us points for discussion later. This is, I guess, part of the contention that wondering without becoming too gloomy or doomsday-sayerish about this whole situation. Actually, I think it's a mistake to be too doomsday about it. At times I've resisted or suggested that we should be resisting some of these changes, but I don't know what has happened in the last 6 or 12 months, but I was discussing some of these issues with a very well-known academic in this field, and he basically said that the game's over in terms of how we understood universities prior to this sort of stuff. And that's anecdotal, I know, but when someone of this Simon's sort of stature and experience understands it like that, I think we should be starting to think positively about how we engage with these changes. So there again, just some points that might lead us towards discussion. I'm not going to go on too much longer about the MOOCs because I'm just as interested to hear what you have to say. As much as anything, my knowledge is as limited and as advanced as others. So it's probably more useful to get some sort of discussion happening after we look at the second part of the presentation on the library as the faculty of the future. The argument here is very much that there have been several streams running through higher education over the last 20 or 30 years. I guess people look back to the Dawkins era as a time when this really significant change started to emerge. I would suggest that this is as good a time as any, but the changes to higher education, well, they're always big, long nominalizations. I think we can think of massification, managerialization, commodification, digitalization, corporatization. Any others that I've missed out? They seem to be the main things that have happened to us over the last at least 15 or so years. And not all of them, I would suggest, are necessarily positive, but in terms of what I talked about or discuss in the paper as a neoliberal reorganization, I think this is here to stay. In a sense, we're not going backwards. And maybe, in a sense, this reorganization of the academy isn't necessarily all, forgive my critical theory, sneaking through again, all evil. And it's about as much finding where positives can be drawn in terms of it. Now, the library has, and will be, I think, effective. I think it already has been. Again, people here who are from the library will know better than me. I don't have special insight into the runnings of the library or its staff collection or its feedback about how its traditional role has changed in terms of providing resources to students, being a, I guess it's got an interesting identity. Just as in the past, the sort of knowledge bank come museum, an archive, a very cautious lender of scholarly resources. I think it is still a cautious lender of scholarly resources, but given the accent that is now being placed on the library as a potential learning commons, I think it is perceivable that the library could even become not just the learning commons, but a learning and teaching commons in terms of the delivery of credit point curriculum. And that's a fairly contentious thesis. I don't know if any moves are underway at Monash, for example, in that direction, but I think it's a possibility, and again, not a necessarily unwelcome possibility. One of the things I do admire about the way things are being done in libraries at Monash is that we haven't fallen over into that complete transformation of the library into these environments that if you go to somewhere like La Trobe, where you see the cafes inside the library, you see the whole feel of the library has changed quite dramatically. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from the experts here today as to how the literature sits with the changes that have happened. Please.
I was going to say, don't libraries form essentially two functions? One is that they're organisers and curators of information that they think is relevant for those that are providing information organisation services to consumers, students, the public, academics, whoever. But then they're also knowledge interface organisations. So I go to the I don't have the book. They allow me to view the book and consume and be a part of the information. I don't have a large map or the facility to see it. I don't have the facility. I don't have a microfiche machine. So often their technology is at least one up or two up in terms of accessing and interacting with information. I don't see all of us ending up with a 3D immersion virtual reality headset room space in our rooms, but we might go to the library to go and be on the battlefield in Iraq and understand what it was like to be in the first invasion and hear the booms and whatever. That's just a potential, like, so why not say the libraries continuing in that space? I don't think that's their idea, but they still, I think, provide those two aims. The information doesn't come with its own navigation system. Google is not really sufficient for that. So there's still a role, I think, for curation and, systematically putting a framework around the information and presenting to us under certain criteria, and also that interfacing at a higher level than otherwise is available. The cost reductions in interaction with information is becoming such, it's always been like this, that their one-upness needs to probably progress, I think. There's always going to be someone like on streets with the cafes, right? I don't really think the library's going to compete on that, but I don't think there's going to be many places in the city which are rightly going to have the funding and central resources to provide these kind of immersive interactive experiences, which libraries have always done for knowledge. That were not available, those experiences weren't available elsewhere. And likewise, I'd love to be able to send my students to experience in a way that they can't currently through their own devices or whatever it is about my content. But at the moment, I don't see what that value rating is. Like, I don't know whether the students or whatever it might be that they can't otherwise access at home. That's apart from the fact of all of the excellent curation work that still goes on in terms of managing and resourcing us to do our work that I don't physically need to visit. The visit part, I think, is the immersion part, which, we could really keep investing in. It's just going to look a bit different.
Yeah, totally.
How many 12 floors of space which is, really devoted to wonderful cubicles of, and social cubicles of kind of impact. That's one idea.
Yeah. Look, and I hope we can have a chance to read through the paper. I present a scenario in the paper where what I think you're suggesting still retains, and is actually, what I'm suggesting is that some of the teaching of actual credit curriculum could shift as well. That's the only point. And what you're suggesting, I think, develop a sort of a silly acronym, a sort of interactive learning zone thing, whereby the MOOCs are presented in the library in terms of the disposition of its collections, which in this, fairly negative perspective, in a sense, all of the books and all of the space, all of the real estate that libraries' collections take up, it's not me that it's bothering. I'm wondering if it's bothering the bean counters, as it were. So it's always putting that as the sort of challenge to justify having a lot of space taken up by hard copies, which again, please don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating this, but that's why I've presented some of this material, is that I think this discourse is out there. Please.
I'm just thinking in terms of a lot of information that we give our students is from scholarly journals, which are behind firewalls.
Yeah.
How does that work with a MOOC? So if people can't access the academic literature, how is that going to, have people thought about how that's going to work?
Yeah, they pay for the resource. So they pay the publisher to make it available in that way, like that.
Coursera do.
Yeah.
But what if you're saying you want the students to do an assignment and they have to go to and search the literature and use the web of knowledge and all that sort of stuff? That's why we need to do a quiz. Yeah.
There are, I think, a couple of different ways that people are tackling that issue. One is textbook providers hopping into bed with MOOC providers and saying, here, we'll offer sort of discounted access or something like that to an e-version of the textbook for this course, and then you recommend it to all your students. Another way is that people will say, here are the resources, go and figure out your own way of accessing them. Another way is that people will say, here are the resources that the on-campus students are using. If you don't have access to them, here's some open access resources that might be fulfill the job similarly. So I think, as
So
far as
getting
I'm aware,
students to investigate primary literature, that's just not going to work, is it?
well, I guess it depends on the students, and it depends on in the context of the MOOC. I don't know how much students investigate primary literature anyway beyond just looking at the video.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking in terms of us adapting our own stuff there rather than the existing ones. Yeah.
Maybe that they can use the virtual private network that Monash has to get people online once you've logged in that you're as though you're on campus. I don't know whether that would.
Oh yeah, Monash students can do it. I'm thinking if you go through this open.
That's also changing in the provision of publications, right? So I don't know about others, but I get an email every week to invite me to be part of a new online journal, which is open access and so on. And I think there are probably, I don't know what the standard journal's going to do. And now when I submit, you can pay to make this or get it published. You can pay to make it open access forever. I tried actually, and my department said no, because it would be too expensive for them. I saw it as a technology transfer benefit for developing countries or whoever who didn't necessarily have the access. But Monash, I don't know if they have a policy on that, but it didn't seem articulated or at least resource at the department level. But there are more resources, and just in terms of primary literature, I would suggest that the student now has more access to literature through Google Books than they probably, it won't cover precisely the detail in every area, but it's something on everything, not just in scope, but in time period. It's very hard to amass in any one library. So I think that's changing as well. The whole kind of stopping, the firewall stuff is probably falling away.
Your public library also has a lot of resources that are.
But I think it's a good point that the kinds of journals that we are encouraged to publish in are, of course, those that are not open access. And so therefore what we should, in this theoretical scenario, be recommending our students read is exactly the kind of stuff we're told not to publish ourselves or are not resourced to do so. So I see that as quite problematic that we're saying it's not good enough quality for us, but here, this is all you get.
All right, look, we're very close to the end of the time, and then let's get something to eat and drink and talk and be merry. Again, being a little bit crystal ball, and I guess this is one of the underlying themes of the presentation, is the sense of enormous change. And in a sense, since the mid-19th century, with the emergence of mass education, there have been sort of technocratic fantasies about an industrialized model of education in both the primary, secondary, and now I think the higher education sectors. And again, one of the points I'm probably urging is that given the MOOC model, I think we're looking closer and closer at this industrialized model becoming more of a reality. I'm not saying the total reality, because as with anything, there will be quite a degree of difference and variety. One of the thoughts I leave people with in the paper that is here is that in some areas of education, higher education, particularly those that tend to be patronized by the wealthy, let's say medicine and law, I think a new class divide will almost begin to prosper, and that whole egalitarianism that has characterized higher education, at least maybe over the last, since the Second World War, I think we're moving back into a sort of a class-based division in the provision of higher education around some of this sort of stuff. Not such a pretty idea, and I can't provide any evidence in support of it, but that's my sneaking suspicion, is that there will be more elite, either universities or more elite sections of the university, while other areas will be MOOCed. Some of these will be certainly a sort of a greater blended model, or at least very much still a traditional face-to-face model. So I'll leave you at that thought and throw the discussion open for people, please. Little consideration.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
So far what you've talked mostly about is a somewhat Australian version of the bricks and mortar university. If this discussion was being had in Oxford or Cambridge, obviously bricks and mortar, the delivery of education for most students is quite different. It's much more personalised. It has more of a mentor-discipleship sort of relationship that we might experience through honours or PhD programs here. In which case, I'd probably be sitting there thinking our model is still secure, because there's such a difference in the delivery and experience of education in that sense, from remote distant, and increasingly. So I think, for example, at Monash, we engage a middle space, which is actually undermining our business model in that we've gone from more focused interpersonal communication to an encouragement now. In fact, you have to have things online. Every lecturer, you must have online components. And so we're actually starting to look more like a MOOC in terms of our delivery, but we're not a MOOC. So we're not actually good, and we don't actually, most cases, have the Nobel Prize laureate in our classroom. I probably wouldn't attend my own class. I'd prefer to go to that one, right? The economist from, Harvard or MIT is available.
Yeah.
So for me, it seems that the distinguish, what is actually being offered is different. But in the future, we probably ought to, I think, move back to saying, well, we're not a MOOC, so we offer this more personalised experience for a smaller subset of the population. I don't know if that's where you're coming from with your class division in that sense. And that's a distinctive university experience where you actually engage with an academic and scholarship on a very personal scale, as opposed to a larger online, distributed, lower interaction environment. And I think the two can coexist, and you can have two being offered by the same university, but with probably specialists in both. I can think of people I'd love to be the mentor, and others, who may not. I want to be in front of the camera doing a video for a MOOC, and others, the directions to something to both. I don't know if you've thought much about that, but I just feel like Oxford and Cambridge, for example, that sort of model is more similar to a future that I think is going to survive on the bricks and mortar, as opposed to ours.
Yeah,
because as somebody that's gone through one and a third of these MOOC courses, the second one fell over because they couldn't cope with the delivery of it. I found it a very personal learning experience because my sense about the current model is that it's very much about the person down in front of the class, not necessarily about the people that are in the room to try and learn. And so what I enjoyed about Coursera was that I could choose when and where I studied. And I felt like the teacher was talking to me. It wasn't a Nobel Prize winner, but it was a person who could communicate clearly. And so I found it a very personal.
But they won't tailor. They deliver they're hopefully very good at it in front of the camera, but they're unlikely to be actually tailoring to your particular difficulty or your particular interest or going down the line of inquiry you'd like. That interaction where.
But I didn't pay anything for it. So I got in terms of value for money, if I want something more and I pay for it, then I'd like it tailored. And to pick up on the question before about getting access to resources, if I really want good assessment, I'm probably going to have to pay for it. If I don't pay anything for it, I can't expect, from my perspective anyway, a Rolls-Royce education. I'll get some knowledge, I'll learn something about the topic, but to me this is where we potentially differentiate ourselves. Maybe it's through the charging for the assessment. Your comment about the quizzes, yeah, in Bloom's taxonomy, it's real low order stuff. Yeah. It's not high order Bloom's taxonomy. And I think if we're going to potentially engage people in that higher order thinking and higher order learning objectives, then a MOOC platform when it's free to everybody, I'd be surprised if that business model survives. Whereas if you want the assessment, swipe your credit card now, I can imagine that surviving.
Yeah, I don't think they're not thinking about money driving the movement. It's just a question of how exactly it works and what partners they need to do, for example, assessment on the ground or whatever else it might be.
Well, it's happening already. I mean, Pearson through their Pearson View test network of global testing centres, they run assessments for edX and also, I believe, they're doing it for Coursera, or at least in discussions to do so. And the other thing that's happened in the States, which I guess has happened sooner because they have a clearer delineation between the levels of their higher education providers, is that community colleges are partnering now with MOOCs to provide the content. Sorry, the MOOCs are providing the content. The community colleges are building, as you alluded to, Matthew, the building an educational experience around this. And if you want to look at the first mover in this space in Australia, it's most likely to be Dixon. Because they've already been the ones where it's most other people sort of jumped on board with someone or other, or said we're looking at it. Deakin have very explicitly said that their attitude is not to create the MOOCs themselves, but to use these as open education resources. And save money on producing content and reallocate that money to more face-to-face teaching. So again, I guess that's how it's, using the MOOCs as content, people are seeing this potentially cost-saving measure to then increase the personalisation of the learning experience for students.
I think that's great, and I think your idea of having this like different categories of courses being employed at Monash is great. So if you want to take a face-to-face lecture, I mean, of course, people thought lectures would die when they introduced the printing press, and it didn't. And even though we can all listen to music on CDs, we all go to concerts, and we can watch David Attenborough for years, but we'll still pay $200 to go and see him face-to-face, right? So I think there's a place for that personal lecture or face-to-face. But it's playing a different role, exactly like you're saying. You have the sort of your routine content can be provided this way, and then you have really high quality kind of celebrity lectures and then small intimate tutorials to support. I mean, just exactly what you said. You pay for one or you pay for the deluxe model. I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, it's good.
And I think the idea that Sebastian Brun, who ran the first artificial intelligence course that you talked about, predicted in 20 years, this was about 6 months ago, he predicted in 20 years there'll be 20 global universities who produce content, and all other universities will just be disseminators. Because his thinking was, if someone can get the content from Stanford, Harvard, MIT, or Oxford or Cambridge, why are they going to go to someone else? But already I think we're seeing a challenge to that, because Coursera and edX are going out to other countries and partnering with the top institutions in those countries. So even though there's a measure of exclusivity in that their contract states they'll only go for top 5 institutions in any particular country, still those institutions may not even be top 100 institutions, or certainly not top 50, and nowhere near sort of the top 10 kind of institutions that started Coursera. So, I think already there's something of a democratization there, even if it's sort of further reinforcing sort of the class boundaries, if you like, in terms of domestic higher education systems.
Yeah. Sorry, it makes me wonder what the employers of the future is going to be thinking about teaching and learning education and the skills that people are acquiring to go into the workplace. I mean, that higher order learning you're talking about, that's what the employers want to see in graduates. So I'm just wondering, some of the drivers of all this and where it's heading is the kind of people, students we want to turn out that prepare them for doing this with individual or whatever, and whether this is actually going to satisfy that, or something it's more than just learning, through MOOCs.
One answer to that is that you get people who are excellent in assessment and higher order. I mean, Pearson's not rolling out more multiple choice quizzes. They're trying to focus. I mean, this is natural language processing, others which will figure out eventually how to mark or auto mark to some good extent short answer and possibly an essay. That would be interesting, at least as a first pass rating. Or perhaps even just giving scores on lower level things so that the human can focus on conceptual stuff. So I think there's going to be technology that will partly solve the assessment thing and get higher order stuff. The other thing is that the employer, I reckon, would be loving this, because they've got students who take the physical infrastructure university is doing all this elaborate marking and time-intensive teaching, plus their students gone and done data mining, artificial intelligence, and how to run a business in their night time, because they're interested in MOOCs. So the access to, scope in terms of education is just ballooned massively. Previously, you had to take a course, be enrolled, attend at a certain time, whereas the flexibility, so it already happens now. I mean, you run a Moodle course and people just love getting in there all the time through the week.
I'm thinking about some of the other skills you develop, the social skills that you develop, working in a workplace.
That's true. They'll be really good at chatting in forums.
It's not working in teams face to face.
I'm just wondering about, I guess this is all crystal ball stuff, we're talking about implications for staff, the number of positions and so on. I mean, it seems to me that places like Monash will want to do this in a way that means they can
train their researchers, right? So if a lot of so I'm in the philosophy department, so it's the way it works now in our department is that all of the face-to-face big lectures are done by the tenured staff, and a lot of the tutorials are done by PhD students. But presumably, if a lot of this sort of big lecture stuff is going to be put into online resources, which seems like a pretty good idea, really, and there's going to be more face-to-face stuff, then presumably us tenured staff will push more into doing the face-to-face group stuff. So I'm just wondering if people have any thoughts about what that might mean for the employment possibilities. But, you know, staff lower down the pecking order, like PhD students and others, it just seems to me they might get pushed out.
The face-to-face isn't necessarily lower order stuff. I think it's actually, it'll be like you'll have 10 students in the unit who'll be and they'll be expecting weekly engagement between one-to-one or one-to-two.
I'm not making a qualitative comment about it, it's simply that the way things are often done now in the humanities, philosophies and our own is that the big team lectures, course coordination, unit coordination, making decisions about curriculum content and so on is all done by, you know, research teaching staff, tenured staff, and often smaller tutorials, grading, quizzes and exercises farmed out to casuals, to sessions. So the thought is that a lot more of that big ticket stuff, big face-to-face group work, lectures, is done by, pushed onto researchers, because universities are keen to make sure that their researchers aren't the ones that are losing their jobs. And we're just wondering whether that's going to lead. So in other words, we're taking over more of the small group teaching.
But they have more time to look into the research.
I'm not, sorry, you're misunderstanding. I'm not worried about us. I'm worried about what's going to happen to our graduate students and the sessional income they rely on in order to feed themselves.
Okay, so
Sorry,
that's a
trying to
different
make
question.
that
That's an
very
economic
clear.
problem.
I'm a tenured, success and researcher. I'm not worried about me, but I'm worried about the PhD students I employ to do a lot of our casual teaching.
I'm just saying they probably get freed up to do other work.
If they can eat, then they might get other work done. But if they can't eat or pay their rent, then 22,000 is what the APA scholarship is, right? They can't survive on that. Humanities PhD students survive on casual teaching.
Can I press it? I mean, this is already happening to a certain extent in the university. In some areas they have already got rid of small group tutorials. And the role of the tutors, the people who used to be tutors, is now help facilitate larger classes. I think what that means is, firstly, there may be less people employed overall in terms of just delivering the teaching. There will still be opportunities for casual teachers. I think there's going to be more and more of an emphasis on casual teachers actually having teaching skills rather than that inherent link between doing a PhD and doing casual teaching. I think that is going to die out more and more. And yes, I think to a certain extent, as that link breaks, PhD students will not necessarily have that ready access to sort of graduate teaching, undergraduate teaching and that sort of income. And yes, that is going to be potentially that is going to have an impact on the system. But again, I think that's something that it's a bit hard to understand how that's going to work until it gets to enough of a large enough scale that the market sort of has some kind of say in determining what all these people who are now suddenly without easy access to work do, and there'll be some kind of response to that. And I think it's that first response which will actually dictate where this goes.
Can I ask a
Thank you.
question?
Sam.
Is the only,
Please let me get back to you.
I'm just wondering about the motivation of pursuing it from the resource provider and the content providers. How do they make money out of doing it? Is it just through paying for the assessments, or is there another way? What's going to perpetuate financially?
Well,
The best answer to that question, if you go on Inside Higher Ed, just insidehighered.com, there's an article today which gives you access to a standard Coursera contract, and in that contract is the avenues that are there for the university to make money out of partnering with Coursera. So yeah, I think that's probably the easiest way to answer that part of the question because it's still very nebulous. The other answer to your question in a sense is that universities aren't always looking to make money out of this. Melbourne is a good example. It's purely a branding exercise.
Well, that is a money.
So it is.
Branding
I mean,
exercise. It is ultimately to make.
Ultimately, they want to make money, but they don't specifically have any aim of monetizing this particular piece of the process. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
How does Coursera?
Again, there's all sorts of things like.
Does it make money? They're playing with many different business models.
Yeah. So.
And they will decide there's lots of ways in the future that they can make money. They're working on data about people and they can be selling that. There's lots of different ways in the future that they may be making money, but at the moment it's an investment.
Again, probably the best thing if you read the contract, you'll see all the ideas they have at the moment of how they might.
Are they making money out of it? No.
Not at the moment. They had a huge venture capital investment, but there's, as you say, the basic model of build it and investment to follow.
Yes, please, and then we probably bring it to.
These are Coursera and Udacity and edX, they're all American based. So we're opening up access to education, but it's American based education, and you might think that religion, Africa now has access to all these courses or knowledge, but it's all done in the context of a particular educational context. So I'm just wondering about that. And okay, there might be universities now getting engaged around the world, but it's going to be the top universities that are going to be providing this. So it's sort of like,
It's the dark side.
is it democratizing education, or is it actually? It's not really. It's maybe imposing education on people.
I mean, the other problem is
Doubling it.
Well, yeah.
But anyway,
the other problem about that is if you take American society as a paradigm. I mean, before he died, Galbraith, the economist, he described American society as one of a public, squalor, and private wealth, and I think that's where things like this are introduced. You do get those extremes of, like in the case of MOOCs, more connection to, say, a global, more connection to global things, but on the basis of people's lives contracting to very private things where, someone mentioned before that the civic benefits of coming to an institution. I think Galbraith described a process where in America, public life has just almost disappeared. There's nothing in between the private and the very global, and there's no institutions in between. And, things like something as basic as someone having a class reunion, isn't really going to happen. The more our relationships become face to screen rather than face to face, and I think this is what is happening, and it needs to be looked at really carefully.
On the first part of your comment, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with the new platform coming out of the UK, which is called Future Learn. That's based around the Open University, a number of members of the Russell Group, but also some non-university partners. So it'll be interesting to see whether that has any clout. It's got a number of the high-ranking institutions, but not Oxford and Cambridge at this stage. And whether something like that has more relevance for Monash perhaps than the US-based one would be interesting to see, I think.
Maybe it just sounds like an entrepreneurial doppelganger to the three big ones in America, but after all, England is a place where the enclosure movement began, and what we're looking at here is just a kind of technological enclosure movement, which sets up a platform where you can reduce staff at university and basically, complete a sort of commodification progress for teaching and learning. That's my view.
folks, we've got to go to the pub.
Please eat some sandwiches.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.